Welcome to everyone, and thank you for attending. We're very pleased that all of you are in attendance as we work to become educated voters for the upcoming November 2nd election. Got this little button. Do you guys all have these? Yes? Head nods if you have them. All right, we'll get them for you. My name is Michael Worth Davis, and I'm the President and CEO of Goodwill Easter Seals, where you are today. And at Goodwill Easter Seals, we are entering into our 92nd consecutive year of service. And no, I have not been the CEO for 92 consecutive years. Our goal is always to work with people with barriers to education, employment, and independence in achieving their goals. And we do that in a variety of ways and programs and services. That array of employment and support services assist individuals in their path to self-sufficiency, and thus helping them eliminate the specific barriers, whatever those might be, that stand in their way in reaching their true potential. Whether it's a physical disability, a criminal background, or a combination of things, our programs help build strong individuals, families, and communities. That's why it's important to us to bring people together for these types of educational forums where we can learn about the candidates, ask questions about things that matter to us, and make a better educated voting decision when we go to the polls. We are proud to be part of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities. That's a broad-based group of more than 100 organizations of people with disabilities, providers, advocates, and others dedicated to improving the lives of people with disabilities. The consortium works to address public policy issues that affect people with disabilities by advocating, educating, and influencing change. Today's event is part of a series of candidate forums being held throughout the state by the consortium and its partners this fall to engage constituents in the election process. The consortium would like to thank the Emma B. Howe Foundation through the Minneapolis Foundation and the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits for helping to support today's event. The lead organizations who have planned this event include the Brain Injury Association of Minnesota, Courage Center, and of course, Goodwill Easter Seals Minnesota, all of which are 501c3 organizations that take seriously our nonpartisan responsibilities. All three major party candidates for the office of Secretary of State were invited to participate in today's event, and we will make every effort to make sure this is a fair and level playing field for the candidates in attendance today. All right, we are very pleased to have with us Mary LaHammer, and she's going to serve as our moderator for today's event. Mary is very well known to most of you because of her role with TPT's Almanac and host of At the Capitol, and as a political reporter for Almanac. She is a seasoned professional who is well known for her interview savvy with all political types of all stripes, and we want to welcome you to the podium to get this started. Mary.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here in a building I'm very familiar with. I am deeply nonpartisan, as most of you probably know, and it's nice to be affiliated with this nonpartisan organization, and this is a cause I can kind of get behind and donate just about everything I ever wear or use here to Goodwill. So let's dive into the debate here and quickly tell you about the responsibilities of Minnesota Secretary of State. It's a constitutional office, and it's a 4-year term. And the Secretary of State is responsible for providing business services to the public, maintaining recording of financial statements, and administering Safe at Home. That's an address confidentiality program assisting Minnesotans who may fear for their safety. Those would be victims of domestic violence and stalking. The Secretary of State, of course, is most well known as the Chief Elections Officer and works closely with state and local election officials. Quickly, the format for today, we're going to have opening statements of 2 minutes from each candidate, and then we'll have 4 questions. Then after that, we'll go to the audience and let you write down questions, and we'll ask them up here. And then closing statements, we will alternate between candidates. And those candidates, right here. To my left, Representative Dan Severson currently serves as the Republican Minority Whip in the Minnesota House of Representatives and is the minority lead on the Housing Public Health Finance Committee. Dan has focused his efforts on champion veterans issues and is a former Navy pilot. Not wearing his jacket today, as he often does.
Okay.
And Secretary of State Mark Ritchie currently serves as the Secretary of State. He previously worked for 20 years as president of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. In 2003, he led National Voice, a coalition of community-based organizations working to increase nonpartisan civic engagement and voter participation. So it's time for opening remarks. 2 minutes maximum. You can come under those 2 minutes. We probably all like that too. We'll start here. Representative Severson.
Thank you, and thank you for the Easter Seals and for the organizations here represented to put this forum on. I think this is hugely important to the community to understand where the candidates lie, but also just for the mission that you do in the community, and I appreciate that. I wanted to give a little bit of a...
Let's let your microphone get up there.
All right, sorry. Yep, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to start out with a little bit of a statement here. It's a little known fact that the disability accessible voting equipment that we have both in Minnesota and nationally would not have been possible without the efforts of former Secretary of State Mary Kiffmeyer. Once the Help America Vote Act was passed by Congress and signed into law, the funding for the disability equipment was in jeopardy because it had been passed separately for funding. For several months, the funding was held up. Taking the initiative as the president of the National Association of Secretary of State, Mary went to Washington to meet with Washington House officials and White House officials in the hopes of loosening up that money. As it turned out, a hurricane hit Washington as she went to D.C. Nevertheless, she kept her appointment at the White House. Because of that action, the funding was put into place, largely because anyone who would suggest cutting it, and it was billions of dollars, the White House and congressional staffers from both sides of the aisle would say something to the effect that Secretary Kiffmeyer came here during a hurricane. This story is little known in Minnesota, but was known to the people and influence in Washington, D.C., both on the Democrat and Republican side. Nonpartisan sources corroborate and marvel at the episode and how the money came to be in place. When Mary Kiffmeyer was beaten in 2006, we lost a national treasure in terms of a disability advocate. In addition to one of the next steps Mary was doing was to institute disability voting equipment in the state. Electronic poll books, another disability-friendly accommodation that would have benefited all voters. Yet when when Mr. Ritchie came into office, he canceled that RFP for this cutting-edge technology.
Okay, and we'll talk about this issue some more, but you are out of time for the opening remark. Secretary of State Ritchie.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the consortium and the organizers. 2006, the disabilities community was a very, very important part of the coalition that helped elect me, and I want to thank you again for those initiatives and efforts. But the main thing I want to focus on today has been all of the assistance that has come to our office from all the different communities, particularly in the Disability Advisory Committee that we formed right after I was elected. That committee has done everything from research. There was a whole research component that Christian Knight from Courage Center led, all the way to advocacy directly at the legislature and testing and giving us feedback on every single step that we've taken to help expand and make significant changes, not only on the election side, but also on the business services side. In fact, 2/3 of our staff at the Secretary of State are involved in business services, and that's a very large part of what we do. But that feedback loop and that mechanism has been really important because there were so many things still needing to be done to make sure that not only were polling places accessible, so that's like the physical barriers, but also tackling the things that we discovered in the research. For example, one of the key elements of that piece of research done by the Courage Center in collaboration with others was that transportation was the single most important issue or barrier that people faced. And we were able to go with that advisory group to Target and some other corporations who helped finance and put some of their dollars into transportation to make it possible for folks to get to the polls itself. But that was just one of the elements of barriers. We also knew people need information. We worked a lot with the Commission on Deaf, Blind, and persons who are hard of hearing to make a video. We worked with the Center for Integrative Communities over at the university, the Disability Law Center. We produced a lot of videos to basically make the information available. And then finally, just being out in the community. If it's a deaf, blind pig roast or the picnics or wherever, we're there. Thank you.
Very good. Our next question will go to you first, Secretary Ritchie. And in this, also, if you could respond to some of the things mentioned here by Representative Severson, too, about the allegations about equipment. It fits into this topic about people with disabilities wishing to vote on Election Day. And now going forward, what would you do to ensure people with disabilities can exercise their right to vote on Election Day, ensuring poll locations are accessible, automark present, and ready to go at each location?
Well, first, in terms of accessibility, we've been able to get about $500,000 from the federal government out to polling places to make different kinds of physical alterations. And of course, we're lobbying each year to keep that flow going. Sometimes it's just an electric door, sometimes it's changing a whole parking lot, but that's a critical element. Disability-enabled equipment is in each polling place, and I think more and more we're beginning to see ways that the next generation of that equipment might be less clunky, less heavy, faster, but the first generation has turned out to be a very good product for us.
Can I jump into what about the claims about that you were not carrying forward Kiffmeyer's initiatives?
I really don't spend time responding to political attack, but if poll books are very specific. We used poll books in this last election in Minnetonka and in a couple other places. We used two different companies, ES&S, who tends to dominate in Minnesota, and DataCard, who is based in Minnesota. It's a very successful experiment in Minnetonka, and in this fall's election, it'll probably move out to a couple rural counties and a couple others. But electronic poll books are, another, $40–50 million project that are good for some things. Let me be specific. If you're fearing for your safety, having those paper poll records in front of you but upside down is a place where a stalker can find your address if they're really persistent. Having an electronic poll book can help add to the safety and security of people who are voting. However, if somebody hacks or steals or somehow is able to get a hold of that, then you have a privacy issue that adds to another set of concerns. So electronic poll books are great. In Minnesota, we've been experimenting with them. We've been asking the federal government for some money to have be able to help local governments and townships, but it's quite a ways away. But I feel like the long-term direction in Minnesota is about things like transportation. When the governments cut public transportation, people can't get to the polling book. When Metro Mobility cannot make scheduled appointments for November 2nd or whatever the dates, you can't get to a polling place. So the barriers identified in the research weren't lack of polling books. They were transportation. They were physical barriers. They were information. And this is what we've been really focusing on addressing is real issues.
Thank you. And Representative Severson, can you address the concerns about privacy, again with those poll books, and some of the other barriers like transportation mentioned in getting people with disabilities to the polls? One study says 20% of disabled folks are less likely to get to the polls.
Well, I think the issue really is about the privacy and the disabled person being able to get there and actually use the machinery. And part of this process has been in the last few years, we have lost some of our skills and the talents because of the lack of training for our poll watchers, for our judges there, because there has not been an adequate training scenario that has been put out. When Mary Kiffmeyer was Secretary of State, they had an aggressive training scenario for our people that were out there doing the work, and that has since fell by the wayside. When you've got complicated machines there, tend to be somewhat complicated, being able to maneuver and work within the confines of that becomes the challenge. So you have to have people that are trained how to use the equipment, and that's what the auto mark process is about. It's about giving our disabled people the ability to vote in privacy. Now, with the whole poll book issue is a system that has been in place for a while now, and I think they have ironed out a lot of the problems that they may have had in the past. In fact, Indiana's had it for the last 2 election processes and has had tremendous success on that. And one of the big benefits about the poll book or about the photo ID process is that when you go in as an individual, all you have to do is hand them your ID card, and they swipe the ID card. There's no need for a verbal saying of who you are or where you live. They merely swipe it, check the ID, check the signature, and then they will have you sign on an electronic pad basically saying that is who you are and give you the ballot. So in terms of privacy, I don't think you get much more effective, and particularly for those in the Safe at Home program, to be able to walk in there And one of the big dangers is that there is a stalker, there's someone that they have hired to go in and find out where that individual is staying. If you're just handing over an ID card and it's swiped, there's no verbal information that takes place. It's all confidential. And I think one of the other issues also is the confidentiality of the polling system itself. Now, we have a state voter registration system, and it is contracted by our state, and the securities that we as the legislator put in place to protect those databases is significant. In fact, we spend a lot of time in our legislature trying to make sure that people, when they have their data entered into the database, can feel confident that data is not going to be vulnerable or susceptible to any outside sources.
And quickly, can you focus too on the disability issue and how some of the things you talked about would help people with disabilities get to the
Well, and I think the issue when Secretary Kiffmeyer went out to Washington, she got the funding, and it was billions of dollars that she was able to bring forward, and that was to get the AutoMark system in place and do the training for that. She accomplished that, and then some of the monies that were coming in from other areas were used to create accessibility.
And what would you do, Representative?
Well, and I would continue to advocate for upgrades in the systems at the local level so that they have access to the polls themselves.
Okay, next question. Historic numbers of eligible voters voted in this primary election, our new earlier primary in August, but still turnout isn't huge, 15%. Can you reflect on how you would increase civic engagement and help people show up for that new earlier primary? Is the date okay? Do we need to play with absentee process, early voting? Let's talk about that primary election. I think you're up first, Representative.
Well, and I think the whole process of early voting I have been opposed to in the current system because I think it just opens up the opportunity for fraud and for maneuvering within the system. However, if we have photo ID in place, I think it opens up the opportunity for early voting and for more convenient access in outlying places because we have more of a certainty that the people who are voting are the legitimate voters and that they are actually having an opportunity to cast their vote in a manner that is able to be backed up. So I think part of the process, particularly for our disabled, is to make it more available and at different sites, and I would be all in favor of that if we had the implementation of photo ID.
And how about the date? You like August?
I like August simply because I think that it offers what is really put forward by the MOVE Act, which is give our military members the opportunity to cast a vote. In that last election cycle, we had about less than 28% of our military that were deployed were able to cast a vote that counted. That is abysmal. Those should be the first to count. And so part of that process was to move that primary date back, which was mandated by Washington, basically, and we as the legislature implemented that process. And so that gave, hopefully, more of our warriors the opportunity, and we'll find out in this next election, an opportunity to cast a vote.
Okay, Mr. Secretary of State, we do great in that general election for turnout, but I think a lot of people like to see those primary numbers go up. Can you talk about early voting, some of the changes already made in absentee voting, and I think photo ID was brought up too, if you can talk about that.
Well, the primary election in Minnesota this year was actually a historic high in many respects. For example, in absentee voting, we had 31,000. That was 50% higher than anyone predicted and 50% higher than we had had at previous levels. We were at about 16%, of which about 80% of those were Democrats. So in most of the primary elections that we look at historically, the question we ask isn't what's the date, the question we ask, is there a hot race? Some precincts in Minnesota had 78% turnout. Some precincts in Minnesota where there were very hot school board races, they had to bring over extra ballots in the middle of the day. Some counties had hot sheriff races with excellent turnout. And the precincts that were all-male balloting, and so about 12% of our precincts are now all-male, tended to have quite good turnout. So what we know from this is that primary elections are the activity of the political parties themselves, and so it's the political parties who have the stake in the turnout. It determines who sits on the ballot. That turnout is driven by how hot is the race and are the candidates themselves spending money, educating people, making it happen. And then third, are those forms of voting, let's say vote by mail, which tends to have a much higher turnout in a primary election, are they in use? Are they being put into practice? States around the country who also had summer primaries like ours that were all vote by mail tended to be about twice our rate, and that's our experience in Minnesota as well. Our precincts that are all vote by mail tend to vote twice as high. I have to say, we had predicted 10 to 12% because there was only one party with a hot race.
Right.
We ended up with 16%, and we were thrilled by that turnout.
Okay, and quickly before you're out of time, photo ID was brought up.
But more importantly, at the state fair this year, we had over double the number of voter registrations that we would normally expect, and we believe it's because the primary alerted the citizens to, hey, there's an election coming, I better make sure that I'm registered, I better get ready for the process.
Okay, and I did want to hear, since it came up, the issue of photo ID.
Photo IDs, we don't have them in Minnesota, and they've been declared unconstitutional as they were challenged by people with disabilities in other states. But let me be very specific. Those of you who vote by mail or absentee ballot could not use your absentee mail or mail ballot because you could not show a photo ID. If you're in Baghdad or Bangkok, or if you're living at home, or if you're in an assisted living facility and you vote by mail, you would be disqualified from voting because you could not show your ID. But beyond that, there's 120,000 or more senior citizens and individuals with disabilities who don't have photo IDs. Some don't want photo IDs, particularly many who are libertarian.
And we're out of time. We gifted you a little more time just to talk about it, but we're out of time. Yep. Okay, thank you. Our next question here, which you get first, so is, are you open to different types of election systems, such as proportional representation, instant runoff, or some mixture of those?
So in Minneapolis, the citizens chose to use ranked choice voting. We used to call it instant runoff voting. And we used it for the first time last fall. And I was actually thrilled to use it because I didn't have to go through the torture of deciding which of all these good people do I simply pick. I had a chance to rank my choices. So I personally really enjoyed that and thought that was a good innovation. St. Paul will be experimenting with it. But as an election administrator, it's my job to say, well, what is the decision of the local community, how they want to run their local elections, and to see what we can do to support that. So, for instance, I don't really have an opinion about ranked choice voting at a statewide level or some other, but what I know is if cities and towns and communities are using that method, then as a state we could help them save money on equipment, save money on software, save money on the procedure, and so we had an advisory committee to do that. But on one point, we have looked at this more closely because 3 states, Louisiana, Arkansas, and South Carolina, found ways to use instant runoff voting to help jump over and make it easier for their servicemen and women serving overseas to be able to vote, because you can kind of skip that primary process if you use it in the right way. So if the legislature passed the moving of the date of our primary a couple years ago, the governor vetoed it. It got passed again, it finally got signed, so I feel like we're in the right direction. But if for some reason we end up with not enough time for our military personnel and others overseas to vote, I want to look at what they've done in those other 3 states to see, could we use this as an alternative if we don't have the proper amount of time to get our ballots out and to get them back.
Thank you. And Representative Severson, same question. These other options, ranked choice, instant runoff, do you like any of them or a mixture of them?
Well, let me start out by just correcting something that Secretary Ritchie had said, that photo ID was unconstitutional. Now, that's incorrect. In 2008, April of 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Crawford versus Marion Board of Elections that it was, on a 6-3 vote, that it was constitutional. And again, last June, in 2010, on a Ply challenge, in the Indiana case, it was League of Women Voters versus Todd Rokita, Secretary of State. There was a challenge that was put forward, and it was again found constitutional on a 4-to-1 count. So it's been overwhelmingly supported. And all of the cases that Secretary Ritchie talks about have been vetted through the courts, and they have been presented and found not to have merit. In fact, what they say is that any inconvenience that the individual voter may experience in acquiring an ID card are far outweighed by the confidence in the integrity that photo ID brings to the election system. Having said that, I'm a huge supporter of photo ID, and I believe it is the answer to many of the questions that have arisen this last year in terms of what transpired with felons being able to vote and fraud that's been in the system.
And how about proportional representation, instant runoff?
And in terms of IRV or instant runoff voting, I oppose that because I believe that the system is manipulable. In other words, there is a room for interpretation. There are ways that you can adjust the ballot, or you can count the votes in different ways in which weigh more heavily on one side than on another. So I think it does not go to the true intent of the Constitution, which is one person, one vote.
Okay. Next question. Let's have a little fun, because I think the whole nation was paying attention to the Office of Secretary of State when we had a famous recount here in Minnesota, the Coleman-Franken recount. There were a lot of changes, bipartisan changes put through the legislature. Both of you were involved and know about that. I'm wondering if we still need to tweak what you'd like to say about recounts and how you'd like to each see recounts. I think you're up first on this one, Representative.
Thank you, Mary. And part of the process was in that I put in a bill that basically spoke to the some of these issues where we eliminated vouching on the large scale, put it in provisional ballots, which actually creates a venue so when the person comes in for same-day registration, they haven't registered beforehand, they can still cast the vote. However, that vote doesn't count unless they've come in within the 10 days to the auditor, verified that information, and then it counts on a recount. And speaking about the recount, I think the people of Minnesota would have been far better served had we gone to something where we would have said, let's eliminate the third candidate, let's go with the two high runners, and then do a statewide recount. And I think it would have been less expensive than that recount process was. And I understand that those provisions were not in place at the time, and so that was not necessarily an option. But there are answers to what happened in that last one. Those are some of the provisions that I would like to see enacted as we move forward. I think there were some huge issues that took place during that last recount, and Hans von Spakovsky, who is a Federal Elections Commission member in Washington, D.C., wrote a white paper in January of 2009 and said unless the Supreme Court addresses some of the issues that have taken place thus far, particularly in light of Gore versus Bush election in 2000, unless they address some of those issues, this recount process will be ripe for a turnover at the federal Supreme Court level. And that was not addressed in many of those issues, and I believe that it would have been overturned had it gone to the federal Supreme Court.
Mr. Secretary of State, you lived through that recount. What would you like to see change, or do you think the changes are now?
Well, first, I was really privileged to work with the two Supreme Court justices and the two judges, and we had the opportunity to look deeply into Minnesota's system, and we had two lawyer teams with $20 million each able to look deeply into those systems. And they came forth with two conclusions that I completely agree with. One is that we have a very strong system built up over 150 years about how we vote. We vote on paper. We have local nonpartisan officials who are the stewards of our process, and we have members of opposing political parties with eyeballs on every step of the process, and that gave us a strong base to stand from. And our recount procedures, who go back to the 1880s, 1870s, but were mostly strengthened after the 1962 recount, were also quite good. But it also told us some things that would be important to change because Minnesotans live differently now. We went out to all the local communities after the recount was over in January, in the middle of the winter. We got a number of excellent ideas from people. Those got put into legislation. They got all passed through legislation. They got all vetoed by the governor. We came back again in 2010, and a lot of those changes got made and have been implemented. And some are actually being implemented this week and next week.
Can you briefly tell us what those changes are? Yeah, just roll.
Well, for example, Minnesota was the only state in the nation that still processed absentee ballots in the polling place after the polling place closed. What that meant was local election officials had to deliver 333,000 absentee ballots to 4,000 local polling places to be processed by 30,000 mostly volunteer election judges. Sometimes they didn't arrive until midnight at night, but after a day of handling nearly 3 million voters. It does sound crazy when you say it out loud, but it's because we had the whole scandal around John Grunseth and we had the death of Senator Wellstone. So we've held on to this procedure, but now that procedure has been changed. We process those at the county or big city level in terms of approving or disapproving, are they eligible, and we now process them at that level. That's just one change. But I'll say what the answer to your question,
Yes,
there's a number of things that were not able to be passed because of the governor's veto, and one in particular is to lower the trigger for the recount from 0.5% to 1/4%. We didn't do just one statewide recount in 2008. We did two, one in the primary, one in the general. A fourth is plenty. Second, we need to move to true early voting. Absentee balloting is growing like wildflowers in this state. It's just popping up everywhere. Everyone wants to vote by mail. It's too much paperwork. It's too much bureaucracy. Even with the new system with early voting, you could go in, you could fill in your ballot, you could stick it in. If you did it wrong, it'll spit it back. You can fix it, and it's in, and it's done. And then finally, the system that we had was incredibly well done because it was done at the local level. It cost, I don't know, $300,000 to do the recount. Another election is about $5 million, just to give you a reference point. We need to put into law that those local election officials are in fact, the officers who will be the most and, have the main responsibility, because the recount actually was conducted by the local officials. Those lawyers challenged 1 in every 3,000 of their decisions, so that's how accurate they were. And when they came to the state canvassing board, there were 14 total disputed ballots in the entire state.
And we're out of time. I let you go a little bit long, so I'm going to give Representative Severson a little bit, because I'd like to know on one specific point there that Secretary of State Ritchie mentioned, would you be open to lowering that trigger for a recount from 1/2% to 1/4%?
Absolutely, and I think we saw that in the last election with a Senate seat determined by 312 votes, that every vote counts. Every vote should be validated and every vote should count. But when you go back to that recount that transpired, and KSTP did a news report last year on this process, they uncovered a number of ballots, a large number of ballots that were handled unequally. In fact, when they interviewed the election judges from the metro area, they said, we're going with the intent of the law. But when they interviewed the election judges from out of state, they said, oh no, we followed the law meticulously. And so when they went forward and they started to show the ballots, they showed some ballots that didn't even have a voter signature on it. And at that point, you got to say, well, you've got people outstate who are really being disenfranchised because they're being held to the letter of the law, and then you have those who are in the metro area who are being told quite a different thing, and through the training process are saying we're trying to go with the intent of the law.
Okay, I think that's probably about fair for time on that one. Let's point out, though, that I think the candidates did agree on something, right? That you both would like to lower the trigger for a recount. So let's all be happy we got to agree on something. Well, we have.
Now you have to convince the governor.
Well, we will have a new governor, so the two of you could do that.
Can I speak to that? Let me speak to the veto issue, if I could. Just quickly. In 2009, the 2009 elections bill was vetoed. It had a lot of stuff, and if you understand what an omnibus bill is, it has a ton of stuff in there. So you don't get to vote on just one issue. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. So there may have been some good reforms in there, but it was not necessarily a bipartisan bill. The one that we got together with in 2010 was a bipartisan bill. It took both sides together. We put together a good bill, and it was passed pretty much unanimously.
Okay, and for fairness, do you want a quick response to that, Mr. Secretary of State? No?
Yes? No.
Okay, good. We're good? Okay. Well, you will get the first audience question. Here it is. Can both candidates address issues of civil rights pertaining to voting rights and privilege regarding ex-felons in Minnesota? Mr. Secretary of State.
Yes, Minnesota happens to have the academic research leader, Professor Uggins, I think his name, at the University of Minnesota, who's been nationally and internationally one of the most important people. So this issue has been lifted up inside of our state. We have a simple law in Minnesota, which is that you lose your right to vote if you've been convicted of a felon, and if you are formally discharged from your prison term, your parole or probation, you are then eligible to have your civil rights restored, and you can register again to vote. And this is different than most of the states around us. For example, North Dakota, the language is incarceration. If you're incarcerated for a felony, you lose your right to vote. If you're incarcerated for a misdemeanor, you can vote by absentee. Every state actually has a slightly different system on this, and it sort of drives people crazy because it's hard to know what it is. But in Minnesota, if you are a felon and vote and you're not yet off paper, you have committed another felony. If you're across the border in North Dakota, it's totally legal, so this is a problem. We had a situation on Election Day in 2008 that helped to highlight a problem that we have in that system. A young man in War Road, which is up on the Canadian border, who had been in prison more or less since he was 17 until his early 20s, had gotten out of prison, was getting his life back together, was trying to be a good citizen, and he called his parole officer to say out loud, to tell him, you know, you have to check in every day where he is. Hey, I'm going to vote. I'm getting my life together. I want to go vote for Senator McCain and Senator Coleman, and he headed over, and in fact, he voted. But he got the voicemail, and so when the parole officer called, he said, wait a minute, don't go vote. You can't vote. You can't vote. That's against the law. And the guy said, what do you mean it's against the law? Nobody told me that. So he had violated the law, but he did not know it was against the law. He got another 1-year sentence. They actually charged him with a gross misdemeanor, and he spent 30 days in the workhouse. But he indicated to everyone in a way that the system wasn't working. He wasn't being told. The legislature took that as a signal that we needed to do something. They passed a law requiring judges to notify felons that they were losing their right to vote. It passed 118 to 9, but the governor vetoed that very bipartisanly supported bill. But we'll go back next year and try to bring this some sanity into that system.
And Representative Severson, how about that specific issue, that bill that the governor vetoed, and the right of ex-felons to vote?
Yeah, and the bill that the governor vetoed was for a specific reason, and I voted against it as well, because all that bill did was that when an individual actually left the prison, they were notified that that if their felony conviction was completed, that they would be restored with their civil rights. And so that can happen anyways. But the process was to put another person on staff with a DCA. Now you have the people that are marching out the door who are still working out their felony status in a parole situation. Those individuals would not be notified. So it really didn't do anything to fix the system. In fact, when you look back at the 2008 and you had felons voting, the reason that felons were able to vote was because on the state voter registration system, their name did not come up as challenged. Because the Secretary of State's office was responsible to make sure that it was cross-checked with the Bureau of Corrections to see that those felony statuses were actually added on the state voter registration system, so when the person did go to the poll and the election judge looked at that particular entry, it said challenge, they would additionally say to the individual, you understand you're under a challenge situation, I have you as a felony status, you cannot vote. If you do vote, it's a felony. So there's an upfront check, but that was not done by the Secretary of State's office, and so we had a lot of individuals who didn't understand. They were still had their civil rights revoked because of the constitutional issue. Really, it turns out to be a part of our Constitution that says if you are in a servitude status, you cannot vote. And felony conviction is considered that servitude status. So it's not a law as much as it is, it's part of our Constitution and a requirement. And so I think one of the things that needs to change in this whole process is that we need to ensure that through the Secretary of State's office that those are updated and that the convicted individuals know when the end of their sentence has been delivered. And so I think that's part of the parole officer's responsibility, and it falls onto the system to ensure that they are not victims in the process because their civil rights have not been restored yet.
And I think we'd like a response on that.
Yeah, first, the bill that the governor vetoed and that Representative Severson voted against specifically mandated that judges must tell felons you cannot vote. And that was the purpose of the bill, and it would have helped. In fact, a judge in Crookston just a few months ago had another young man in front of him who was voted, was not told, and the judge threw the case out. He said, you've got to quit this. You've got to fix the system. And so I feel good about that. But let me say one other thing about this discussion about Department of Corrections. Our office has asked for that authority. We finally got the authority, but Representative Severson voted against it. The governor vetoed it. We had to come back again. And in fact, we'll actually be able to run that data list in the net. It's mandated that it start on October 1st, and so it happened. But again and again and again, when positive suggestions have been made by local people and they've been put into legislation and then they've been vetoed by the governor, it may be, a part of a kind of a partisan game, but there's something about making elections part of a partisan game that just sits wrong with me. And one of the real dangers of that is that elections are not simple matters. When somebody says, oh, we want to do this with elections, we want to count the absentee ballots in the county, there has to be a complete rewrite of giant computer systems to do that. So when the governor vetoed this legislation and then chose to sign it in this year of elections, it created incredible tension on all the local election officials who then have to jam their work. So the whole business of creating a kind of partisan battles around election and election administration and those kinds of bills goes against the grain of what it takes to run a nonpartisan election system in Minnesota. And I think this is something that is really part of the reason why the disability community was so strong in supporting me in my race in 2006, was people said, we got to get the politics out of that office. We've got to have an office fighting for people with disabilities and others who've historically been locked out of the process. And I think
time here. Yep. And let's bounce back one time on this, Representative Severson, too, and specifically, should judges inform felons that they cannot vote? Can you answer that? And also, what we heard Secretary of State Ritchie saying, that partisan battle and politics really have nothing to do with elections and shouldn't be involved. Can you quickly respond to those two?
Yeah, absolutely. And the bill that Secretary Ritchie is referencing may have said that in the verbiage, and I fully believe that the judge absolutely should be informing the individual that his civil rights are not restored, and they won't be restored until he has completed his felony conviction. Now, when they actually understand that is the real point of contact here. And so that's the challenge, is to make sure that they aren't being duped into thinking that when they walk out the door that their civil rights are restored. That's why this bill was not a good bill. And all it did was it really put a false sense. It put additional manpower requirements on the Bureau of Corrections, but it also, I think, gave a false sense of security to the people that were walking out the door that they were going to be actually able to vote.
And is that partisanship? Is there a fear? Do you dislike partisanship or politics factoring into elections?
Well, and I think particularly in the Secretary of State office, it becomes incumbent because it is with the trust of the people. It's not like when you are in the legislature and you're Republican, Democrat, there are two sides of the aisle. You are the individual. And I don't believe there's room for partisanship in the Secretary of State's office. And that would be my goal, is to say, you know what, I am engendered with the trust of the people of Minnesota. I would work to make a very transparent and accountable system, and that's why I support photo ID, because I believe that photo ID brings that to the office.
Okay, our next audience question. Minnesota has the 4th highest rate of individuals on probation. Many of them live in the community, pay taxes, and have children, but are denied the right to vote. Do you support restoration of voting rights for people on probation? Somewhat of a related question here. Yeah.
I'm first.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah. Yep. Well, again, as I said previously, it goes to the Constitution. You know, the legislature can do all we want to do, in our opinion, in this process, but the bottom line is the way the Constitution is written is that someone in a servitude status cannot be reinstituted with their civil rights. And so that's part of the process, is to say, you know what, if you want to change that, then it's going to have to go to a constitutional amendment, because I believe if it was reinstated at the state level, that there could be a constitutional challenge to that.
Same question.
Yeah, we're sitting down with the Association of County Attorneys because they are really fed up with how dysfunctional the current law is and what the chaos this has created. And they're going to come forth with recommendations, and I'm very much looking forward to their recommendations. They're the ones who actually have to deal with this. Secretary of State's office doesn't really deal with it. All violations go to the county attorney. And so those county attorneys have a special task force they've created that'll be interesting. I met with the people in North Dakota because they use the word incarceration. That's one of the things that has been recommended. But we know from all available academic studies that voting is part of feeling reconnected to the community and reincorporated into the community. We know this from every single study that has ever been done. And so we need to think about how our current system is denying people that path. Does it have impact on recidivism and therefore other costs? And what can we do in our current system to help engender that reconnection to the community? The two young men I mentioned, one from Warroad, one from Crookston, they thought they were doing the right thing and becoming good citizens and getting their life in order. So that says to me that part of the process, as the academics have laid out in studies, is true in the sense of how they express this. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what those county attorneys, what that special task force comes up with, and really doing something about this problem.
Okay, and a fun question now. I'm going through withdrawal, not having my phone and not tweeting or texting right now. So somebody just asked, and I think Representative Severson, your phone just went off.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll throw it in the audience.
Relevant one. Do you believe there could be a future to online voting or text message voting? And Ritchie, you're up on this one.
When the government is smarter than the hackers, I think we can have a real conversation about this, but...
Are you saying that isn't true now?
I would say that the government of China and the People's Army of China's ability to hack into the core of our U.S. Pentagon computers tells me that putting a presidential or any election online for that possibility is something that's a little scary to me. However, the internet and online has been an unbelievable tool for getting the word about where to vote, how to vote candidates, and we're at a forum about disability. I'd love to get back to those questions. In Oregon, which has gone to all-male voting, they were sharply criticized because they really didn't give the same opportunity to people who were permanently in wheelchair-type, computer-assisted type assistants. In other words, people who were permanently in wheelchairs and were speaking through computers and communicating through computers. And Oregon figured out a way to do this in a secure way for that really special group of Oregon voters. And I said, you know, right on, and, you know, we helped nominate them for some prizes and stuff. So the Dutch government tried all internet voting, and I got to watch it with a Dutch citizen here. It was all fun. But the hackers in Holland came up one day and said, oh, that was very clever. You spent millions of dollars. We're going to make your system play chess. That night, they made that system play chess, and the next day, the Dutch government said this was a failed experiment. So my sense is that there are many, many things that we can do with the internet and with digital technology, especially handheld technology.
But yeah, quickly, is texting in a different book for you?
Well, so we use texting now to make sure people know where they're going to vote, if a polling place has to change, if a pipe burst or that kind of stuff. Texting, of course, is used to, you know, help get out the vote, that kind of thing. But again, having survived the recount and knowing that in polling, 67% of Minnesotans think the recount was really fair and made them really proud to be in Minnesota. The fundamental fact of why that was true is that we had paper ballots that all 2.9 million people who were watching it day in and day out on the uptake could see and observe every single ballot. So a paper ballot is fundamental to a recount.
Representative Severson, online voting, text voting?
Well, you know, I think there's a future in it, and I think part of the process, you know, I'm a naval aviator, and we had a NATOPS training manual that was this thick, and we used to say it's written in blood because of the experiences that were, you know, gone through by previous people, and you learn from that.
Is there a future in it now?
I think there is.
Government ready?
Yeah.
What about those hackers?
And I think the process here, and the perfect example would be our warriors that are fighting overseas right now, because they have secure data cards. They have government data cards that they could use to input into the system. You have a small control group that you're able to really run the tests on, ensure that the group isn't blown out so large that it really affects the large-scale elections. But we could actually implement it and actually give all of our warfighters an opportunity to cast a vote that counts this time. So I think that would be an excellent opportunity. I would have hoped that we would have had it this time, but that's not the case.
Okay. Moving on here, with more and more people calling themselves independent, is there a place for a third party in Minnesota? The two of you represent the two big parties. Does the current system prevent this from happening? What do you think? You're up first, Representative.
I don't think it does. I think there's always... I think the system works best with a two-party system, but I think there's always room for, you know, a third party. In Minneapolis, there seems to be about 6 parties. I think that runs into some particular problems, particularly if you're starting to embrace something like ranked choice voting. Then it really becomes a nightmare. But I think with a two-party system, you always have the give and take. You always have the push and pull that tends to keep parties in check and keep hopefully us in the middle more than on the extreme.
Does the system allow enough ballot access so we've had an active independence party? You know, how about the system?
I think so. I think, yes, I do.
Okay, and Secretary Ritchie.
We have 6 formally registered parties in the state. The Constitution Party, which is strong kind of in the southwest corner of the state. The Libertarian Party, which is strong in some of the suburbs. The Green Party, which is strong in southeast, up in Duluth, in the metro. The Independence Party, which is, of course, a major party always on the ballot, Democrat and Republican. And those 6 parties, we've been meeting sometimes quarterly, sometimes twice a year to talk about ballot access, and I can tell you 3 problems that are raised in those meetings. The first one actually comes from, particularly the Republican Party and the Libertarian Party, who are really concerned about people who don't share their values being able to participate in their primaries or to have their names on the ballot. If you collect signatures and do enough of it, you can list yourself as a libertarian, even if you don't have libertarian values. And the head of the Libertarian Party is quite eloquent on this problem. And Ron Kerry, when he was chair of the Republican Party, was very concerned about the ability of people to just sort of decide to cross over in a primary, and some of the difficulties that he saw from the Ron Paul supporters from that. So that is an issue that comes up among all the parties, big and small. The second issue is that for the smaller parties, they do not have the right to just put down $300 and be on a primary or be on the ballot. They have to gather signatures. And sometimes the dates for the signature gathering have been very, very inconvenient. There were even proposals to move the filing dates that would force those small parties to gather signatures in the middle of January and February, in the middle of the winter. And so they obviously would like to see some changes in how small parties have access. And then finally, there are, 30-40% of people who are truly independent. And I had the privilege of running it with 4 people, somebody from the 3 major parties, and then a truly independent person, an expert, Bruce Kennedy. And I have to say, having those other voices in the race helps to broaden the overall debate and discussion. So I'm strongly in favor of doing what we can to make sure that every person feels like they have a place in the system. That's why one of the reasons we have such high turnout is that people feel like, I'm a Green, I've got a Green candidate. I'm a constitutionalist, I've got a candidate I can support.
All right, another audience question. This is a personal one written. At times, election judges don't know how to work the automark machines. They aren't aware of locations of accessible entrances and don't know how to handle vouching for folks who live in group homes. What would you do as Secretary of State to strengthen the disability-specific content and probably training for election judges?
Yeah, and this happens at 2 levels, so I'll speak to it just on kind of a formal level, and then I'll speak to it informally. At the formal level, typically it's the county that does all the hiring, firing, and training for our election judges, and sometimes in bigger counties it's the bigger cities, and so they're also responsible for the training, and there's a tremendous amount of training that goes in, and also there's a certain number of hours that are required. And each time that we've seen the evolution of this, we've seen an increase and a kind of intensification of the training on the automark machines. And this year, because we eliminated the need for poll workers to process absentee ballots, we essentially took away one of the most time-consuming parts of the training process, and people were able to spend a lot more time, not just on the automark, but on some of the other issues as well. So this is, there's been a fundamental shift in moving absentee ballots out of the polling place, and this allows it to happen. But the other part of this is just that our whole society needs to be educated and more motivated about making sure that curbs are cut and people don't park in front of the cut curbs, that the signage is there, not just up high, but where people can see it, so that there's a whole change in consciousness that's needed. And I've been a strong advocate with the disability community about the implementation of the new requirements. We've also seen that we've had to work with our fellow citizens because there isn't yet the consciousness about the need to do this. I would just speak, for myself personally. I feel like there are opportunities as I walk through the day to educate my neighbors and fellow citizens about the issues facing people with disabilities, all different kinds of disabilities, and my job is to take that responsibility at every one of those instances, and that has to be as strong as my work in my official capacity to make sure that the counties are implementing the various laws, rules, and procedures. There's a personal change that has to take place in our community alongside of the institutional changes that have to take place in the system.
Representative Severson, respond to this audience member who says the judges aren't always trained on the automark machines and trying to help people with disabilities get to the polls.
Well, I think that's a big problem. And as I was talking with Secretary Kiffmeyer previously on this issue, she had implemented training teams once that she was instrumental in getting the automark machines in. In fact, they came to her, and she worked with them directly because she had some disabled members in her family to get people on the ground to actually do the research, work with the company to put the design together. And that relationship that formed between Minnesota and the disability polling process gave great advantage to Minnesota. She implemented that, and then after she had implemented that process, she implemented a tremendous training process where she had interns come in during the summer, and they would go out during the summer to all the polling places and instruct the local communities on how to implement and how to train, how to actually use the AutoMark machine. That unfortunately hasn't been continued, and I think that's what generates this question. I think there's one issue of accessibility to the polls, but the other is once you have them at the polls, how are they able to actually work the machinery? And that's the part that I think has been very frustrating for our election judges, because we only do it once every year, once every 2 years at the max, and sometimes if you've been away from it that long, it takes a refreshing course. We have not had the correct training environment to get our election judges up to speed on how that process works, and that's a function of the Secretary of State's office, those training videos. But I think also, just as Secretary Ritchie had talked about, there's incumbent at the local level to ensure that our polling places are disability friendly, and that that is an issue that I think needs to be addressed, not just at the local level, at the legislative level as well.
Okay, another great question, by the way, audience. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Good questions. The median age of election judges in Minnesota is quite high, meaning these folks will age out of their positions. How would you encourage a new crop of judges, diversity in mind, persons with disabilities, and people of color? Representative, you're up first.
Well, and I think it's a great question. And how do we get people engaged? When I ran for, as I'm running for Secretary of State office, I have been out saying, you know what, this is part of your civic opportunity, part of your civic responsibility. Become an election judge. Become engaged in the process. And we had a tremendous influx of people in this election cycle who have said, you know what, this is an important civic process. This is an important civic duty, and we're going to step up. So as I've gone around and talked with people, it's been encouraging to see them get engaged in this process. And it's not just about separate, the Republican community, the Democratic community. It's about the community at large, all the minorities especially, because they have the opportunity to be at the polls to see how the process works. And once you become part of that process, you respect it, and you encourage integrity in the system. And
how do you encourage that? How do you encourage particularly that diversity and getting some younger people in there?
Well, and I think that's part of, for me, that was part of the process, was to get out as I'm campaigning and saying, hey, you can be part of this process. It's not just about voting. It's about being an election judge. It's about being a poll watcher. It's about being part of the process. So I think that's not just for me as a campaigner, but as every individual in the community. And as you meet different individuals from different communities, to encourage them to participate in the same manner.
Okay. Mr. Secretary of State, I know you've talked about this, worked on it. Tell us, how'd you do and what would you like to do even better?
Well, here's the great news. Pundits said after the recount, people wouldn't want to be election judges anymore. Too much a hassle and that kind of thing. And it turns out, I've been out in most of the counties, and the county people said, hey, you know what? That recount really triggered interest in the community, especially among younger people, and they've had big increases of people turning out and younger. So let's have another recount, and then we'll get more younger. But I think more importantly, there's some conscious things that have been done. Minnesota has a special law: 16 and 17-year-olds can be election judge trainees. I spent a lot of time in junior high school classes. They're not really voters, so you might question my judgment, but they are the 16 and 17-year-olds who can be election judge trainees and poll workers. We have special materials. We work with the State Social Studies Association, in everything that we can do, from Project Citizen to History Day, you name it. We're out there talking to that audience. But I think the bottom line of this is not just getting younger people or sort of all the demographic. It is getting a kind of a change in mindset so that election administration itself, from poll worker trainee to poll worker to assistant election judge to working in the system, is a highly respected part of public service. And we've seen that in the sort of professionalization at the election administration level. We've seen it at the sort of provision of new kind of certificate training for poll worker and poll worker trainees and for election judges. But we also see it in the pride that people take. And for me, that's the thing that's been fun, and going around the state and talking on college campuses or wherever it is. People are really proud of our system. They watched us, go through this recount and get all this national praise, and and plaudits and whatever, and they want to be part of that system, and I think that will bring in. And on the kind of other side of this, people's lives are more busy, they're more stressed, there's more economic things going on, and so we have to be mindful. I know in some townships, they've had to increase the pay to poll workers to $20 and $24 an hour because they just can't recruit enough people. So we have to listen to the economic issues and the personal issues and make sure that we are mindful of that as we recruit more people in as election judges.
And we have to be mindful of the time, too. Another great question from the...
And have appointed election judges by the governor. And the best quote I have on that is he's now had to retire because of his age, but he was the appointed Secretary of State in Florida who said this system of having the governor, and he loved the governor, and he was an excellent Secretary of State, but he said this system of having the governor appointing the person who's running the elections for the governor cannot hold up to citizen scrutiny in a close race, and I just think that's true. Now, there are some interesting proposals. I think in some states they're talking about taking Secretary of State races totally into the public finance arena. You know, we have had various laws in Minnesota where there was a $50 rebate and that kind of thing. Basically banning campaign contributions, limiting spending, and providing whatever that amount of money is through the public system. You know, we now have about, I don't know, a fourth of that being provided by the public system, but that would take campaign contributions out. So that's an interesting proposal. But I've yet to hear somebody describe a system better than standing before the voters every 4 years and saying, have I run this office in a way that makes you proud? Has Minnesota's system been maintained in a way that's respectful of the history that's brought us here? And have we been investing so that the future will be just as safe, secure, our election system will have the same integrity and will have the same high degree of trust and therefore participation in the future. So every 4 years, that's the accountability mechanism that we use. We've had it since our Constitution, since we were founded. Seems like a pretty good system to me.
Okay. Representative Severson, nonpartisan, appointed Secretary of State?
You know, I would hope that there would be a possible way of doing a nonpartisan. I don't believe there is in our current system when we have the party struggle. I think the way we're doing it is probably the most accountable to the people. And having said that, these are races, all of the legislative races, the executive branch and the constitutional branch, are referendums on how the individual has performed in the job. If it's an incumbent running again, and if there's someone that's running up against him, that's because they don't think that the incumbent did that great of a job. That's why I'm running. Because in the 2008 re-election process, I think that there was some major issues that not just myself, but a large majority of Minnesotans said there was something that just didn't feel right about that re-election. When Norm Coleman went 700 and then systematically dropped down to 312 in the opposite direction without any recourse, and the recount was supposedly very transparent. But as I did some of the digging into the whole process, I found out that there were major problems. In fact, I wasn't even considered about the recount when I started this process. There was some complaints that had been put to me about some disparities that had been experienced up at the polls up in northern Minnesota. And the more investigating I did, the fewer answers I could get, until it came to the point where I was a sitting representative of 40,000 people, couldn't get any accountability. And I thought, you know what? If I can't get any accountability, the average citizen who complains probably isn't going to get any answers either. And so that kind of put a whole light on the system. And I think that is what our election process is about. If you see something wrong with your government, you have the opportunity as a citizen to step up and say, you know what? There are better ways we can do this. There are better things that we can do to make sure that our system is accountable to the people who elect them. That's why I'm sitting before you today, because as a sitting legislator, I couldn't get the answers. And it was manifest in the whole process when we had felons that voted, our military was not able to vote, and we had more voters in that last election than we actually had people signed on to cast a vote. We've got problems. And to say that that was an easy or it was just a transparent system is fine to say, but the facts say otherwise.
Okay, we have time for one more question from the audience before we wrap this up. It's a positive, nice note to end on. Why do you think Minnesota has such high voter turnout when compared to other states? Representative Severson.
Well, I think that people in Minnesota are genuinely concerned, not just concerned, but their relation is to participate in their government. I think that's part of the process, and we have tried to make it as easy as possible to allow or to encourage, not to allow, to encourage people to vote. My concern in that process, though, is that as we do that, we begin to open up the system to make people feel good. This is a civic responsibility. We are doing a very important task here when we are electing the people that are going to govern in our government, and they are going to be the stewards. They are going to be our public servants. And that has a lot of gravity. And so in that process, we have to have a balance of, are we making the system so friendly and easy that it's open to fraud and it's open to abuse? And on the converse side, do we make it so difficult and cumbersome that nobody wants to participate? In Indiana, where they implemented photo ID in 2004, 2006, the first trial of that, they saw a 13% increase in the number of participants in that process. Photo ID actually caused confidence in the system that caused a growth in the actual voting base. The next year in a presidential race in 2008, they saw another 2% on top of that. That tells me when people are confident in the system, they will participate. Conversely, if they think that there is fraud or the system is too loose or their vote isn't going to count, they don't participate, and you start to see a decline in the amount of participation.
Okay. Mr. Secretary of State, why do we vote in droves?
Well, we vote in droves for many different reasons, but here's 3 quick ones, and then I want to say about the people who don't vote in droves. First, we have 6 political parties at least, and that allows people to find a home for their political values. They're green, a constitutionalist, libertarian. There's somebody there for people. Second, we're really the pioneers in the modern era of same-day registration, and that's at least 10 points increase because we use same-day registration, and that's true in all the states that use same-day registration. And third, it is part of who we are. I asked a group of folks up at Red Lake Indian Reservation, I said, you know, why does this part of the state, the other part of the state votes very high, just like most of the state. But I said, you know, why are people here so active in the elections? And I was kind of silent for a little bit. It will make me nervous. But a young woman stood up the back and said, when I drove in, I drove past the Veterans of Foreign War Hall. Is a huge building up there. And she said, inside of that hall is a list of all the braves who've given their life for this nation. And she pointed at the ground. She said, we love this earth. We are very patriotic, and we vote. And the entire room nodded and sat down. And just a little bit later, a few months later, I'm in Hermantown, you know, up near Duluth. I'm at the Rotary talking to the head of the chamber, and I said, hey, how come you guys up here, you know, vote in such high rates? You know, it's really unusual. And he didn't blink. He said, we are very patriotic, and we take care of the things we love. And in my mind, that summarizes it, that Minnesotans love this place, and we take care of the things we love. We don't just say, oh, we love this place. And voting is part of how we take care of the thing that we love. There are 1 million people or more who won't vote this year. I'm not happy about that. Some will face barriers. We've been trying to address barriers facing our military, and we've tripled military voting from 06 to 08. We have some people who haven't been introduced to our system. 75,000 young people turn 18 each year. We have to welcome them. But some people feel like their vote doesn't count or the system's broken. We introduced this Vote in Honor of a Veteran program as a way to say, hey, you know, dedicate your vote in a broader way to people who've served in our military and served our nation. And by reading the tributes they write to their family members or others, we can see in their language how this alters them. Several of them said, you know, I never voted or I didn't want to vote, but when I thought about my uncle on the USS Arizona or when I thought about my daughter in Kuwait, I realized that it wasn't important whether my one vote mattered. What was important was that I was participating in a system that had been built up by the sacrifice for over so many years. And so I think I'm concerned about the million and some who won't vote. I think we need to tear down barriers, invite people, but also think we need to talk about this in a larger context.
Okay, we'll let you take a deep breath because we'll do a closing statement in just 1 second. Thank you so much, audience. Great group of questions here. And we'll go right back to you, Secretary of State Ritchie, for your 2-minute closing statement, please.
What we haven't really been able to talk much about is all that we can learn from the disability communities that can help inform us about our civic engagement, about the other things you would do. But if you'd like a real blast of energy and inspiration, go in the back of this building where there's a lot of warehouse space and there's big bins with a lot of donated, particularly medical devices, wheelchairs and other things. And there's a book of pictures of what people with disabilities have done creatively and innovatively with those donations all over the world. And it will blow you away in inspiring you about what people can do with what we have been gifted. And some of us have been gifted with great wealth, and some people gifted with great intelligence and great all kinds of different things. All of us here have been gifted with the great gift of this democracy and the opportunity to vote. And so that gift of that opportunity, we need to be thinking carefully and deeply about how we honor that gift, how we make sure that gift is taken well care of, and how we're investing into our future. We have future issues that are relevant, and the disabilities communities need to help us think about it. 1 in 100 babies now are being born with Down syndrome or someplace on the autistic spectrum or find some other challenge. These are going to be voters. We need to be thinking about that process. Many of us are going to get older and older and older. We are going to be less able than we are now. We need to be thinking into those demographic changes. The disabilities communities can help give us the guidance, the leadership, the inspiration, but also the will and the power and the energy to make the kind of transformations that are needed. This community of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and broadly in the state is so rich by all the different voices and the diversity. You know, we are so blessed with that gift. We need to find a way that that gets channeled into the creation and recreation of this democratic process, this democracy. Voting is one piece. It's an important piece, but it's part of a larger way that we have created this wonderful state that we get to live in. Thank you again to the organizers. Thank you to Mary LaHammer for helping keep us on track.
And finally, Representative Dan Severson, 2 minutes closer.
Well, thank you for putting on this forum, and particularly I was talking to Mike at the start of this, and he was complimenting his staff here and talking just about what great people they are. And you know, that is America. America is one of the only nations in which we have the type of nonprofits, the type of people who have a heart to serve other people, and we as a government have said, you know what, you are special, we set you aside. I've sat for the last 4 years on housing, as the minority lead on housing, public health, finance, and I've had the opportunity to see a lot of the community organization groups come in and give their testimony in committee about their passion for those that are underprivileged, for those that have disabilities, for those who do not have. And to see the community come together with a heart to serve, to do what's best for the community has been an inspiration to me. And to me, it has been proof that those entities that work because of their passion and their drive to see justice done, to see that people are served at that level, rather than government do it, because government has been overbearing. It has been more of an impediment than it has a solution, has been inspirational to me in that process, and particularly for us in this capacity as Secretary of State in implementing some of the issues that we need to implement to make sure that the individuals who are having these particular challenges have access to the polls and that they have their voice heard in America. America is an awesome place. It is a place of opportunity. It is a land where you can dream something and you can see that dream come to pass if you're willing to take the risks and you're willing to work hard to make it happen. And so one of the dangers that we have in America to those liberties and those freedoms is an far-reaching government. And that's why I think these institutions, these nonprofits, like the Goodwill Easter Seal, are so important to us and to our communities because they really embody the heart of public service, of taking care of our neighbor, which is really what America was founded on. I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today, the spirited debate, and I look forward to meeting some of you afterwards.
Thank you, candidates. Thank you, organizers, and thank you, audience.